Donald Trump views foreign affairs and domestic affairs through one single prism. Does this benefit Donald Trump?
China, the Chinese ambassador to the UK, Zheng Zhehuang, has been summoned to the Foreign Office after the arrest of a BBC journalist in Shanghai. And last night, of course, in Rishi Sunak's first major foreign policy speech, he set out his take on relations with China. Let's have a listen back to this.
Now, let's be clear, the so-called golden era is over, along with the naive idea that trade would automatically lead to social and political reform. But nor should we rely on simplistic Cold War rhetoric. We recognise China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism. Instead of listening to their people's protests, the Chinese government has chosen to crack down further, including by assaulting a BBC journalist.
That's Rishi Sunak speaking at the Guildhall last night. We can now welcome to the studio Ambassador John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, and he is here with me. Good afternoon to you, Ambassador. The Prime Minister there, we heard Prime Minister treading this delicate line between doing political and business deals with China and treating the regime as a hostile power. He spoke of robust pragmatism, which could be read, I guess, an almost infinite number of different ways. What would be your guidance on how to interpret this sort of approach?
Well, I think the Prime Minister referred to China as a challenge, and I think that, with all due respect, is mistaken. China is a threat. It is a threat today, and it has been a threat for some time in ways that we've only recently even begun to understand. And I think the threat is growing. It's not just a threat to Taiwan or to other countries around the Indo-Pacific periphery. It's a threat to us now. Let me give an example. Huawei and ZTE, well-known names, are not telecommunications companies. They are arms of the Chinese state, and their aim is to get control of fifth-generation telecommunications worldwide so that the information transmitted over 5G telecoms can be sent back to Beijing. Now, we have taken in the U.S., starting in the Trump administration, continuing in the Biden administration, the U.K. has taken, other countries have taken strong measures against Huawei. But we're not dealing with a competition threat here. We're dealing with an espionage agency. Yeah. And if you look at China's behavior across a wide range of military and political activities, it complements what they're doing in the economic space. It's not a question of one BBC reporter being beaten. That's unacceptable, to be sure. But the threat here is comprehensive.
Certainly the American administration takes a more aggressive approach to China than the British administration just at the moment. But we've seen Huawei excluded from the core operations of 5G in this country. The British government is in the process of, as it were, buying Chinese interests out of a nuclear energy project. What more should be done by way of coming down hard, as you would no doubt wish, on China?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is more fully appreciate the whole of society approach that China takes here. And they can do it far more easily than we do because they're authoritarian. But the challenge is economic, it's political, and it's military. And we need strategies to deal with all of them. In the U.S., we are particularly focused on countries along their periphery. And Taiwan is really the epicenter of that. But the nature of this threat, and it's a growing threat, is worldwide. That's why things like the AUKUS partnership, Australia, the UK, and the US, to build nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. It may sound like it's a long way away from London, but it threatens us all very directly. And I think people need to understand this better. It's not rhetoric. It's a reality. It's a military, economic, and political reality that China is confronting us with, combined with a lot of other things, stealing intellectual property from the West for 30-plus years, producing it in their own factories and selling it into our markets at a discount, which is fairly easy to do when you don't have to do research and development. That's the examples add up. But what we don't have yet is a real strategy across the board.
All right. Now, clearly, you want to see a more aggressive approach to a potential and a real potential threat. I mean, going back to your time in the White House and looking ahead to the next presidential election, you've been public about how President Trump in the White House put deals with China above national security. And he told President Xi Jinping to his face that he, I think as you put it, approved of the concentration camps being used against Uyghur Muslims in China. Does it follow from those experiences and those accounts and your general thinking that Donald Trump in a second term would pose a danger to America and the West when it comes to China?
Well, I think as a general proposition, Trump was not fit to be president. And my assessment was he did cause damage to U.S. national security and to the country as a whole in his first term, all of which was repairable and can and should be repaired. What I feared was that in a second term, both at the national security level and domestically, he would cause more permanent damage, which is why he shouldn't get one and why, in my view, he shouldn't get the Republican nomination in 2024.
And you also take the view that President Trump, now hoping to run as a nominee for his party again, would be a similar threat when it came to relations with Russia on your own account.
That's right. Donald Trump views foreign affairs and domestic affairs through one single prism. Does this benefit Donald Trump? He sees relations, let's say, between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Russia, as whether he has good personal relations with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And that is a mistake that allows them to take advantage of us. These are hard men, and they know exactly what they think China's interests are, Russia's interest, and they pursue them. Donald Trump is pursuing something completely different.
Now, on Ukraine, as we've seen in the recent midterm American elections, the Republican Party took control of the House of Representatives. Now, do you think that will do anything to weaken American support for Ukraine? Because there is a core of members in the House of Representatives and elsewhere in the party who are very skeptical about supporting Ukraine. Will that have any material effects?
No, I don't think it will have any effect at all, really. This is a very small number of people who want to cut off assistance. I think there will be demands for more transparency and accountability, and I think whenever the federal government spends money, we should have more transparency and accountability. So I think Republicans will support that. But the reason that this is a question at all is because of Donald Trump. Why does Donald Trump care about Ukraine? Because he thought the famous Hillary Clinton server was somewhere in Ukraine. And he thought that Hunter Biden and others were conspiring to defeat him in 2020. And he thinks Ukraine is a very corrupt country. That's what these people are reflecting. And as Trump passes from the scene, he leaves no policy legacy. He leaves completely idiosyncratic, knee-jerk reactions to things. And I don't think it will effectively change the mainstream of Republican foreign policy at all.
Well, does President Biden then, is he striking the right balance when it comes to the American policy approach to China and to Russia?
No, I don't think he does, because I think he suffers from many of the misapprehensions of other people in his party, that these are responsible governments that will make commitments that they will honor, when the history is they do exactly the opposite. I think also the Biden administration is overcome with the imperative to negotiate some international agreement on climate change, and it affects their willingness to press hard on other national security issues. I mean, one example was a few days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, John Kerry, former Secretary of State, now the international climate negotiator, said this war in Ukraine is going to be terrible. Think of all the carbon emissions that it will cause. And then he went on to say, but I hope we can negotiate with Vladimir Putin on climate change anyway. I mean, this is living on a different planet.
Well, let me just ask you about an issue which is running quite hot in America, on a domestic American policy issue. I mean, Donald Trump, he's drawn a lot of criticism in recent days, including today in the US media, including from fellow Republicans, for having entertained over dinner a famous anti-Semite, a racist, Nick Fuentes, at a dinner at his Florida estate. Now, we're pretty familiar with your own views on your former boss. Did that affair, that dinner, meeting Fuentes in the way that he has, and he hasn't condemned him as far as I could see since that dinner, does that tell us anything we don't know about Donald Trump? And will it make any difference to the fight for the Republican nomination?
Well, I think this incident will have an effect. This is unacceptable conduct. And at an absolute minimum, Trump should apologize, which he shows no sign of doing. He's trying to minimize what happened and pass it off. He liked Fuentes at this dinner, it's reported, because Fuentes liked him. It's just that straightforward. But there is one important aspect of this. You know, many people commented when Trump was campaigning in 2016 or as president that one thing would happen that for any other politician would be catastrophic. But the next day, Trump would do something else,
Yes.
and that would be removed from the discourse, and people would focus on that until the next day when another thing would happen. This Fuentes Kanye West dinner is still out there, and it's a reflection Trump is no longer president. And I think the corrosive impact is more and more people look at this unacceptable behavior on Trump's part will have more an effect than it did when he was president.
Is Donald Trump a racist?
You know, I've never heard him say things that I thought were racist, but I think everything in his mindset translates into how does this benefit Donald Trump. So how did he meet Kanye West? Jared Kushner suggested that it would be good to have him to the Oval Office, and they did, and they got a lot of publicity on it, and Trump probably figured that that was a good thing with the African-American vote. I don't think that's racist. I just think it's simple-minded.
We'll just going ahead now, and time's running out of me, but looking ahead now to the nomination. Donald Trump has had a big chunk of the Republican Party establishment against him in the past, and he has prevailed. He's got a big chunk of the establishment in the GOP against him again. Would he prevail, or is he still a contender for the nomination, a strong one?
Well, I don't think you can rule him out, but his base has been shrinking since he left the White House. My own polling and other polling shows that. Nobody should be surprised at this. He goes from sitting in the most powerful office in the world, the Oval Office, to sitting by the swimming pool at Mar-a-Lago. What do you think is going to happen? And I also think people look at his act and they say, we've seen this act before. It's old, it's tired. They want a fresh face. And I think there are a lot of potential presidential contenders for the Republican nomination. I don't think Trump is going to get the nomination ultimately. I have to say, if he does, he will lose in the general election in 2024, and he will take a lot of Republican House, Senate, and gubernatorial candidates down with him. And I think people in the party now understand that better than they ever have before.
Your bet seems to be on Ron DeSantis in Florida. Is that about right?
He's certainly the lead. I know him well. I have a lot of respect for him. There are a lot of other contenders. My view is competition's a good thing. Let them all set out their wares. Let's see what they've got.
John Bolton, good to talk to you.
Thank you for
joining us on the program this afternoon.